and you're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, here with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon.
Thank you, Garland.
The U.S. empire is threatening that Sudan will be punished if it allows a Russian naval base in the Red Sea. Also, imperialism and capitalism are bleeding the world dry, and has the U.S. declared war on Germany again? Joining us now to discuss this and more, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to The Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
We'll start off with the U.S. threatens African nation over Russian military base plan within weeks of his arrival in Sudan. The first U.S. ambassador in 25 years has already threatened Khartoum with consequences if it follows through on a deal with Moscow for a Russian naval base on the Red Sea. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, is anyone really surprised by this turn of events in light of the inglorious, despicable history that the United States has had with Africa over the centuries, which led to the unlamented African slave trade and then support for apartheid South Africa and its ravaging and devastation of the subcontinent? But we need to take this move towards Sudan even more seriously, because the United States has had a particularly pernicious relationship with Sudan, which at one time was the largest nation geographically on the African continent. But under the regime of George W. Bush, the U.S. authorities were able to manipulate the secession of South Sudan from the larger Sudan, reducing its landmass. And you may have noticed that in the pictures you see of South Sudanese leaders, many of them will not appear in public without Texas-style cowboy hats, which is their particular homage to President George W. Bush. But it's even worse than that, because recall that when Mr. Bill Clinton was in political trouble in the 1990s over the Monica Lewinsky scandal and other scandals, he seized the opportunity to bomb Sudan, supposedly because there was a chemical plant there, supposedly because they had housed comrades of the late Osama bin Laden. But that was part of the utter disregard for the humanity of people of Sudan, which is not seemingly de-escalating, because as we speak, you have this crisis in that part of Africa whereby the Sudanese are being accused of involvement in the situation, in the crisis in neighboring Ethiopia, more to the point, the neighboring Tigray province, and Sudan itself is still undergoing turmoil because of a military junta which is reluctant to share power with civilians. So apparently the U.S. ambassador feels that he has Sudan on the back foot, and therefore he can push against this African nation aggressively. But that ambassador needs to realize that there are people outside of Sudan who are watching carefully and are going to remember this kind of 19th century gunboat diplomacy, which hardly was suitable for that long past century.
When you take into account the UN fiasco that only, I think, 4 African nations backed the U.S. resolution at the UN condemning Russia, we have the Khartoum government signing this agreement in 2017. Of course, now we have a new government in place, but it seems as though the trend is away from the United States, and the United States could wind up being incredibly embarrassed, to say the least, if Godfrey's warnings are not heeded.
Well, your latter point needs to be taken quite seriously by this audience. That is to say, we are undergoing on planet Earth a major transition away not only from the hegemony of U.S. imperialism, but to a degree the hegemony of the Anglosphere, which since the 16th century, starting with the tiny England and then motoring through the British Empire up until 1945, when the United States takes the baton, has been in the driver's seat. But because of ham-fisted U.S. efforts to retain hegemony, not least the deal cut with China, you now see China in the driver's seat, or about to be in the driver's seat, I should say, more accurately. And the United States apparently will not go down without a fight. In fact, there are statements coming out of Washington that in 10 years, it might be all over for U.S. imperialism. So the time to strike is now. And so I don't think you can begin to understand these maneuvers in Europe, the heightened tensions with China over Taiwan, the summit that is being held in Washington with small Pacific nations such as the Solomon Islands, to get them on side with regard to the encirclement of China. You cannot begin to understand what's going on, even in your own backyard, people of Washington, without understanding this major transition. And in this transition, Africa is going to play a major role because the resources of Russia are supposedly going under boycott, which means that there will be more emphasis on Nigerian and Angolan oil, on natural gas from Algeria, and also from the vast untapped resources of Sudan.
And might I add that what we've also seen is the price is driven up, so Russia has to sell less and make more, so it doesn't work anyway. But something you just said, and made me think about this, because we've got this article. So the U.S. is angry and they're going to strike out at somebody, and it looks like Germany was the somebody. Germany and EU have been handed over a declaration of war, says Pepe Escobar. The sabotage of the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 pipelines in the Baltic Sea has ominously propelled disaster capitalism to a whole new toxic level. They're beaten up on their own now. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, I'm afraid to say that this hubbub about who sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline, and it's apparent that it was either U.S. imperialism or rogue elements within U.S. imperialism, or U.S. imperialism operating in conjunction with allies in Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. The Baltic Sea, where the pipeline was transversing, is basically a NATO lake. And if you look at the Daily Telegraph of London this morning, you would get the idea that it was Vladimir Putin himself in a submarine, or from a remote push button in the Kremlin, who detonated this pipeline, which of course means basically savaging and destroying Russian interests. But it reminds me of the run-up to the 2003 attack on Iraq, when there were similar fibs and misleading statements, to use a euphemism, and that led to this catastrophic attack on Iraq. Now, I trust and I hope that the hotheads recognize that dealing with Russia is not the same as dealing with Iraq. But I'm getting those sorts of vibes, and I must say it's quite concerning. And with regard to the previous point concerning the crisis of U.S. imperialism, recall that it was former U.S. Treasury Secretary John Connally, the former governor of Texas, Treasury Secretary under Mr. Nixon, who said about the U.S. dollar, it's our currency, but to the world, it's your problem. And you see the same issue today. That is to say, as the dollar strengthens, is having negative reverberations from London to Tokyo. But Washington does not seem to understand that the world is moving away to a degree from these old-fashioned fiat currencies to currencies backed by commodities, which is one of the reasons why the ruble has strengthened since February from the 70s to the 50s, despite being under these so-called punishing sanctions that were supposed to reduce the ruble to rubble. At the same time, Russia, as you know, is awash with commodities, natural resources, and at the same time, it's selling oil to China and India at cut rate prices, which then is selling it on, which is helping to convert China into sort of a commodity king, which at the same time buttresses the point that China, if you pay attention, is really soaking up quite a bit of gold. And India has done that historically. And so once again, that's further evidence of the world going through a transition as countries begin to trade without the dollar, de-dollarization, to use the term of art, where Moscow trades with Delhi in rubles and rupees, with China in rubles and renminbi, and Washington is on the sidelines with steam coming out of its ears and feels that it still has a military advantage, at least that's what it thinks, and that if it does not use that military advantage sooner rather than later, then all is lost.
Imperialism and capitalism are bleeding the world dry. At the General Assembly, Nicaragua's Sandinista government called for a global rebellion against the, quote, imperialist and capitalist system, end quote, that is, quote, bleeding the world dry, end quote, condemning illegal sanctions and war. It urged a new multipolar order. Well, it seems that the order has already been placed and that the order is being delivered on when you look at the way that things are starting to shake out, especially with the SCO meeting. It seems as though there's no turning back now.
No turning back indeed. And I was quite impressed by the remarks of the Nicaraguan representative, likewise with regard to remarks of the representative from Honduras. The fact that both are in the metaphorical backyard of U.S. imperialism speaks volumes as to the nature of the crisis. But I think it's also important to note that in terms of the new stage that we're entering, you have specialists on Wall Street who no longer speak of emerging markets, which are oftentimes a descriptor affixed to the so-called third world, but submerging markets. And London, England, Great Britain is first in that category. I trust our audience is paying attention to what's going on in that European country, which is now the sixth largest economy, and what's going on in Germany as well, with the collateral damage of the Federal Republic being part of the price for this conflict in Ukraine, with deindustrialization supposedly in motion, in train, in the fourth largest economy on planet Earth. And one would imagine that, as has often been said, if your right flank is collapsing and your left flank is retreating, well, you should not advance, you should retreat. But alas, that simple lesson has not dawned on the North Atlantic nations.
We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and a researcher. He's got a number of books. You can just go anywhere where you find books online, and Dr. Gerald has upwards of 30 books. I would recommend personally the one on Paul Robeson, but that's just my prejudice. They're all